Welcome to part 3 of my Great War story. Now, as I've said already, I've learned so many things in the course of researching my grandfather, and I wanted to talk to you today about all of those military files. In part 1 and part 2, I frequently mentioned details I'd learned about people like Jimmy Smallbone or the cook Simmons, and I would mention the military files, and I thought it might be helpful to have a short little talk to you about what are these New Zealand military files, how did I find them, and why are they so easy to access. And what you're looking at over there on the left is page 1 of my grandfather's own World War One service file. Now, to try to explain why they're all available, I want to talk to you about how every country has pivotal events in its military history that they consider to be nation-forming events. So the United States has its Revolutionary War, its Civil War, and of course, World War II. And in the lens of World War II, it's Pearl Harbor and D-Day that are the events that everybody thinks about. And what we have here is a photo of my visit to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and that is the USS Arizona Memorial that is built over the top of the sunken wreck of the USS Arizona, a major event for the Americans. Now, for Australians and New Zealanders, their major pivotal nation building event were the landings at Gallipoli in Turkey on April 25th, 1915. Many New Zealanders and Australians died, and that is why on that day we hold our anniversaries, our memorial days for the soldiers who fell. Anzac Day, April the 25th, every year, starting, well, in fact, they started right away. The landings were in 1915. They were already holding Anzac Day ceremonies in 1916. And you can see, especially, that the year 2015, the 100th anniversary of this, was a big deal. The logo on the top right was formed with the red poppy, the memorial poppy, with the New Zealand silver fern, New Zealand WW100, the anniversary. Now, this photo you see here doesn't actually show Gallipoli. Now, many years ago, I did actually visit Gallipoli in Turkey, so I know what the beaches and the landing sites look like. And I took this photo actually not far from where I live, down on the coasts of Southern California. And I can tell you that the land is quite similar. Similar rocky beaches, steep sandy slopes, terrible for trying to dig trenches into, and the Turks were commanding the slopes high above. And it's no wonder that the troops landed and never got off the beaches. It's like D-Day, where you land in April, eventually you give up and evacuate in December, and for all of those months, you're just stuck. It's D-Day plus World War One trenches and never getting anywhere. It was a disaster. And partly because of that, and partly because of everything else that happened in World War One, every little town you ever visit in New Zealand, you'll find something like the statue on the right. It'll be a memorial for the local boys from that local area who went to war in World War One and didn't come home. New Zealand had a population at the time of about 1.1 million, and 100,000 New Zealanders served, 9 or 10% of the population. It was a huge event, and it's left ripples that have shaped New Zealand and Australian history ever since. And these are from much more recent commemorations. You can see they built a massive museum, a really good museum, by the way, in Auckland, New Zealand, the Auckland War Memorial Museum. In front of it stands the cenotaph, very similar to the cenotaph in London. And on April 25th every year, they will hold dawn services there, and many people will turn up for them. There were thousands there for the dawn service on April 2015. And you can see in front there's this incredible water feature with the twin silver ferns and the words "Lest we forget" as the water all runs down it. And all of these wooden crosses were put out as a temporary exhibition. If you go to the other side and look backwards, you'd actually see the name of a New Zealander written on every one of those crosses, representing an individual soldier who died in World War One. Now, as you may have picked up already, I don't live in New Zealand anymore. I now live in Southern California. And I thought for the 100th anniversary, I better get off my backside and get involved in the events. And she attended two different ceremonies for the 100th anniversary. Three of these photos, all except the top left, are an event from the big military cemetery near UCLA. And you can see that they had representatives of the New Zealand, Australian, Canadian, French, even the Turkish government was there. And the US military really put on a good show. They had a flyby from some jet fighters. And up on the top right here, those three guys are Americans dressed as New Zealand World War One infantry. I spoke with them and they told me that they were just from a military reenactors club and they didn't have any particular personal connection to New Zealand. They just had chosen, for whatever reason, that the thing they wanted to reenact was New Zealand World War One infantry. And they turned up to this event, and there they are honouring the wreaths that had been laid down for the well, for all of the people who died at Gallipoli. And also in San Diego, they have a great World War II aircraft carrier, the USS Midway, as a museum now. And they held events on that. And again, they had flybys from jet fighters of the US Navy. And I was very impressed how the Americans came to the party and honoured the special day for their Australian and New Zealand allies. And actually, that bottom right photo, if you look carefully, you can see me sitting on stage at the back, just in front of the French flag. Speaking of military reenactors, I actually met those World War One reenactors one at a time at this military reenactment day down near the port of Los Angeles at San Pedro. And there they are again, dressed as New Zealand World War One infantry. And while I was there, they also saw a different exhibit. They had this working Bren gun carrier, and written on the side was not the British are coming, but the Kiwis are coming. And you see one of them on his shoulder flashes has Long Range Desert Group, New Zealand. I spoke to this guy as well, and again, not a New Zealander. He just felt that the Long Range Desert Group was really cool. There were a lot of New Zealanders in it in North Africa and during World War II, and they just felt that that was what they wanted to make their thing for military reenactment. Quite amazing. Now, if you want to find a service file, everything is freely digitally available from the New Zealand Government Archives. And this was all part of the 100th anniversary events of Gallipoli. The New Zealand Archives undertook this incredible thing to scan about 140,000 service files and make them available. And the absolutely astonishing thing to me is it's all free. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to request it. You just go there, you look it up, you pull it up. It is such an incredible tool. So when I wanted to find the service file of Jimmy Smallbone, well, that was pretty easy. Smallbone's a fairly rare name. Sometimes there are other ways of searching for them. You can search from the service number file. So my grandfather's service number was 5/77. I then pulled up to see who was 5/76, who was 5/78. They would have been soldiers who signed up at the same time, who were also in the Army Service Corps. And that was another way you could find out interesting things. You can always tell just by looking at their service file number, roughly when they signed up, roughly what kind of job they were doing. So if I find a person who was in the same time and place, or I find somehow they were associated with my grandfather, it's really easy to go to the New Zealand Government Archives and pull up their file and search through it. And it's led me to many interesting and sometimes quite amazing discoveries over the years. Now let me show you what you get. Now first off, I want to show you 3 images here. And at first sight, when you go to the digitally scanned images, you think you're looking at 3 different pages, but in fact you're not. And it's a good lesson in what challenges you face when you are trying to scan historical artifacts, because you can't break them when you are trying to scan them. And if you look on the left here, you can see there was something like a yellow sticky note on the top. Then there was another piece of paper that was overlaid under it. And under that, yet again, there was a white piece of paper. So when they scanned it, well, the next image shows that they have folded up the yellow piece of paper and scanned it again. And then the next image, you can see they've got the white bit of paper and they've folded it off to the side. So each different image represents something else that's going on, because this piece of paper, well, it's not quite 3D, but it's almost 3D in the sense there are multiple layers. So they have done their best through multiple scans to let you have an understanding of what was there. But in fact, don't be misled. You're not looking at 3 pages. You're looking at a single page as best they could represent it when they scanned it. Now, there's so many details in my grandfather's file. I couldn't possibly talk about it in the 20 minutes I'm trying to keep this video to. So I can only look at a few details here, but you can see interesting things. What unit was he in? He started in the ASC, the Army Service Corps. It's crossed out. He left the Army Service Corps. Then it says NZ Machine Gun S, New Zealand Machine Gun Section. So you can see from that where he started, where he ended up. Next, you can see his ranks. You can see his ranks bounced all over the place. There's corporal, lance corporal, private. There's a sergeant ranked up there, and most important of all, as I've mentioned already, his service number 5/77. Anybody whose service number started with a 5 was in the Army Service Corps. If you're in the artillery or the infantry or some other unit, your service number would have started with a different number. Something else you can tell from this number. You can tell that he signed up very, very early. That's a super low number. The 77th man registered in the Army Service Corps. That tells you he signed up in August of 1914, the month the war began. And anybody through the rest of the war who saw his service number would have known this. Later on, in fact, by the time you get to about 1916, they stop doing this and they just issue everybody who signs up a 5-number code, a service number. So if you see somebody with a service number of 25,000, you know they probably signed up in 1916. If you see someone who has a service number of 75,000, they probably signed up at the beginning of 1918. If they're 79,000, that would have definitely been later in 1918, etc., etc. You can find things about what job was he doing. He was a dairyman working for J.A. Douglas in a place called Matapu in New Zealand. You can see his religion, other things like this. You can see other interesting details. And again, don't ignore the bits that are crossed out, because you've got his father as his next of kin with an address in London. That's crossed out. That tells you he doesn't want his father as next of kin anymore. Why the change? Now there is his wife, Mrs. M. Fowler, with her address in London. So again, you can see some change that's been happening in his life as the form gets updated. Now, when I was talking about Jimmy Smallbone, I looked at his conduct sheet to see how often he got in trouble, and it's only fair to talk about that for my grandfather too. And I was able to decipher this after a fair bit of effort. So there's Zaytun again, that Egyptian place name, the 2nd of January 1915, and his offence was striking a native, with another date written by it, the 30th of November 1914. And for this infraction, he was punished with 7 days CB, which is confined to barracks. What on earth was going on here? I don't know. Perhaps I will make a video in the future where I speculate about what might have happened, what we know and what we don't know, but that is for another day. Now, in some of the service files, you will find these dark blue, almost grey forms. Now, again, I've noticed after looking at many, many forms, people who signed up in 1916, 17, 18, they never have these coloured forms. It's only men early on in the war. So I guess it was a stationary reform that they had a lot of at the start of the war, then they ran out of them and they didn't use them anymore. And you can see similar things at the top. He was in the ASC. You can see there's Field Bakery. Later he's in the New Zealand Machine Gun Corps. You can see again his ranks are bouncing around all over the place. All of that kind of information. And then again, vast amounts of information, so much to unpack. I've spent many, many hours going through each word. And honestly, the biggest challenge often is just reading the cursed handwriting. And you don't just get one set of handwriting and you learn it, because different bureaucrats would have written on these forms at different times. All of them had different styles of writing, and some of them are nearly impossible to read. So you can see here his very first posting, ASC attached to. Okay, I could read that. Attached to, who knows what it said. And then the place name. Again, I had no clues. So I had to reverse engineer some of this. The place. I had an inkling that he was probably in Egypt at the time. So I typed into Google NZEF, New Zealand Expeditionary Force, Egypt 1914, and went through a lot of the results and the images, and I found a map showing a lot of place names associated with the New Zealanders in Egypt. And one of those place names was Zaytun. And then going back and comparing what was written on the form with this name Zaytun, I could go, yeah, okay, I can see that that does say Zaytun, that weird looking squiggle thing at the start would be a cursive capital Z. I was able to work it out. Now, this unit, what on earth did that say? I puzzled over this. I looked at it, I tried it, I tried typing out everything I could think. I even used Google autocorrect to try to work it out. Eventually, I managed to get the last two parts, that this was field, F-I-E-L-D, and this is A-M-B, field ambulance. Once I started Googling and researching field ambulances, I found out there were a type of field ambulance called mounted field ambulance. That let me work out that that was MTD, mounted field ambulance. Now, there's not a million years in which I would have been able to work that out without coming at it in reverse. This squiggle thing here, it looks like a capital C. It turns out it has no meaning at all. It's a cursive flourish as the person's winding up to write a capital M, the mounted field ambulance. Second line was a bit easier, nominal role. Embarked for D apostrophe Nels, which was, of course, the Dardanelles. They were off towards Gallipoli, and they didn't land on April the 25th. You can see his unit were delayed by about 2.5 weeks. They didn't set out until the 12th of May, 1915. Now, through looking at these files, I could see his initial rank was driver and that he was in an ambulance. And if you're like me, you would have read this and you would have thought, oh, well, I know what he did. He drove an ambulance. And you would have been completely wrong, because the title driver doesn't refer to somebody who drives a vehicle. It was a rank in the British Horse Artillery originally, and it was a private in charge of looking after the horses. We still use this word when we talk about a cattle drive. You're driving the cattle. Well, in this case, you're driving the horses. So driver is just a private in charge of horses. And an ambulance isn't a vehicle. The Americans would refer to an ambulance as a mobile army service hospital, a MASH unit. So what you're looking at here is not 4 ambulances. You are looking at 4 wagons that were part of a New Zealand unit called the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance. And this fellow holding a horse over on the right, for all I know, that could even be my grandfather, because he almost certainly was a driver, a private, in charge of looking after the horses. Now, if you've ever seen an Australian movie called The Light Horseman, it's mostly about a famous cavalry charge. Well, I shouldn't call it a cavalry charge because they were mounted infantry. They didn't have swords. They just had bayonets, which wasn't very effective for a cavalry charge, as you can imagine. But it was a famous incident in which the Australian mounted infantry charged the Ottoman lines at Beersheba in October of 1917. And if you do watch the movie, you'll see that one of the main characters is actually in a mounted field ambulance unit attached to the Light Horseman, and, well, you'll see it featuring as quite a major part of the story. And my New Zealand grandfather was in the New Zealand equivalent of this, the mounted field ambulance. There were other field ambulances that were attached to the infantry. The mounted field ambulances were attached to the mounted infantry units. Now, here are some of the other sheets you'll find in the military files. You'll see here the military history sheet, and very often you'll find a crucial detail. What ship were they on when they left New Zealand? What were the dates they're at sea? Where did they land? Again, the particulars of his marriage, that he got married on the January the 1st, 1919, at what location and all the rest. And then you'll always find their attestation papers. Now, attestation is what happens when you first join the army. You sign up, you sign your signature saying, I do solemnly declare that the answers by me are true and I am willing to fulfill the agreements made. This is your contract with the army when you first sign up. So the attestation papers tell you everything you want to know. Well, not everything, but many things you want to know about this person when they first signed up to join for war. So who were their employer, their name, where did they live? Had they ever had any military service? Yes, my grandfather served in the cadets in England. It's only this form that tells me that. I didn't know anywhere else. And then over here, you get their vital particulars, height and weight and eye color and all of the rest. Now, I would just like to conclude by advertising a Facebook group. It's a Facebook group, the Unknown Warriors of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, run by a guy called Ian, very helpful and friendly. And his thing is finding old World War I photos of New Zealand soldiers and trying to ID them. Who was this man? And he has a really sharp eye at spotting particular badges. He can say, yes, he was a member of the 21st Reinforcements. Yes, he's a member of the Field Artillery. And Very, very helpful. And I couldn't work out how those service numbers worked, like the 5/77. What did it mean? It was only thanks to the help of Ian that I was able to understand that the 5 actually meant that my grandfather had to have been in the Army Service Corps when he signed up. So I would like to thank Ian and highly recommend that if you use Facebook, you like and read through all the Facebook posts from the unknown warriors of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. Thank you, and that's all I have for today.